Jennifer, thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. Thanks to all of you for your interest in this topic and for being here. Um, it's funny, I just earlier today did an interview with a journalism student who said to me, I really want to know how you got interested in this field. And I hadn't thought about the answer to that for a long time, but when I started, I was a first year student at the University of Washington, way back when, as an undergrad. I was a double major in math and psychology. Interesting duo. Why was I a double major in math and psychology? Because I realized math was the greatest thing ever. And if I could just use psychology to motivate people about math, they would realize how awesome math was. First, that was very misguided by me. And second, a little nerdy. And third, probably explained why I didn't have a lot of people to study with. But when I started taking math classes, I'm like, these are very engineering focused. When I learned you could do science and statistics and psychology, I was sold. So I'm going to say three things before I share my screen. First, and I probably, Jennifer, should have made sure this is correct. I'm sending a PDF of my slides to you. So if anybody wanted this, oh, Jennifer's nodding. Know that those are coming if they are useful for you later, for note-taking purposes, you name it. Second, I would fear the person that claims they have all the answers. That is not me. I'll do all I can. I have a 45-minute window at most. I'll do all I can to address the wishes tonight. And third, absolutely feel free to use the chat. If you need me to go quicker, challenge accepted. If you need me to slow down, please let me know. Any feedback you want to pass on. If there's a question you don't want to ask and be identified, you can direct the question just to me or just to Jennifer. We'll see it's a direct message, and then we don't have to read the person that asked it. So know that if that makes it easier for you, we'll absolutely be willing to do that. So with that, I am going to share my screen and dive right into this today. Big thank you to all the folks associated with making tonight happen. Jennifer, you've been such a joy to work with on email. I thank you for everything you did to make this happen. And as I look at this list, we just have so many prevention heroes in our state. I'm just really both appreciative of and honored to be a part of the prevention community. And thank you all for doing what you do. Thanks too for all of you for doing what you're doing to make time for this tonight. What were the objectives? We wanted to talk a bit about rates of cannabis use among youth, identify at least two unwanted outcomes or consequences relevant to youth, and identify resources for parents and adults in talking with youth about substance use. I also want to thank Zoom, which seems like a weird thing to thank, but Zoom is gaining emotional intelligence. It's gaining empathy. You wouldn't think that's true, but Zoom is learning. The first year of the pandemic, that wasn't evident. But after we hit the second year, I was like, whoa, Zoom is totally learning. I was asked to do a presentation for the state of Louisiana. And when they sent me the Zoom link, it actually said, which is how I feel all the time. I was like, wow, Zoom, you get me. And now it won't stop. Here was Syracuse in August, Michigan in October, and lo and behold, tonight. I clicked on it and there it is. So, wow, I actually feel more understood by Zoom than a lot of people. When we talk about cannabis use, the language has changed a lot. 10 years ago in the scientific literature, you saw things that talked about smoking or at best, maybe addressing edibles if people eat it in something that's cooked into food. And what we've seen is that the way in which people use, the means in which people use, how people use can be different. Cannabis can be smoked. There's smokable bud or flower that goes into joints, bongs, pipes. There are, vaping is a verb. There are vaporizers for vaping. It can be brewed as a tea, gummy, cookie, brownie, edibles in quotes. But newer to the market are concentrates. Dabbing is a verb. There are dab pens for using dabs. What does that mean? It's extracted or concentrated cannabinoids. The most well-studied cannabinoid in cannabis is THC. When people say, I used something and I got high, it's THC that drives that. So hash oil, butter, why is it called that? it looks like, but is of course not the dairy product. Shatter looks like broken glass. I'm going to say more about all of these as the night progresses, but if people smoke or vape, they're going to feel it pretty immediately. And their subjective sense of the high varies based on how much they used, how potent it was, and so on. If it's orally ingested, there's more of a lag. The published literature says at least 30 to 60 minutes. People are warned often about the potential for a 2-hour lag. Think about why that happens. If someone eats the proverbial cookie or brownie and says, I don't feel anything, so you eat a second one and they're like, really? We paid for this? They eat a third one. If they're like, whoa, now I feel it, they still have to absorb all the rest that they ingested, and they could way overshoot how high they intended to get. So even things like overdose risk, when we look at edibles, becomes much more noteworthy. Because of that lag, because of the different onset of the high, it also lasts much, much longer. And again, I'll talk about that a bit. I also want to say a quick word about terminology. Our state's Liquor and Cannabis Board partnered with our state's Department of Health and ran focus groups because they started getting some feedback that although people have historically talked about marijuana use, that historically that term hasn't always been used with such great intentions and often could be used with very racist intentions. So they wanted to know, what words did people understand? What words did they use? And here's what I'm going to say to you. At the end of the day, use the word that a human being you're talking to uses. If a student says, I used weed twice, we're not going to correct them and say, could you not call it that? We'll use what word they use. But what the state said was, we want to know what words people understand. This link will be in your handouts, complete with this typo, which is literally part of the link. I kind of think that's funny. I was like, is there a typo? Nope, it's due to budget cuts, the letters N and O were eliminated from the terminology. But it's you can go and look at the complete document. When we talk about it with kids, when we talk about it with youth, young adults, the term marijuana is the term that most people understood and were okay using. Again, at the end of the day, you know your own community best, you know any one population you're working with best. At the University of Washington, I worked in a student life office where we screened students and we asked them, have you used cannabis in the last 6 months? They would say no, but then when they met with us, say that they used marijuana every day. And it's like, hold up, you said you didn't use cannabis. And they're like, I don't know what that is. So we do want to make sure that we're using terminology that lands with the group we're working with. When we talk about norms, by all accounts, the last 23 months have not been normal. And we certainly have preliminary data that show that as people were more virtual, as there was less hanging out after school, across the board, especially for youth, you saw rates of substance use go down. We're trying to keep our fingers in the pulse of where that's going as we speak. I just want to, you're going to see a consistent story emerge. I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly. These are data from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and their National Survey of Drug Use and Health. This looked at 2015, 16, and 17 among 12 to 17-year-olds on the left, 18 to 25-year-olds in the middle, 26 and older on the right. Two things. First, I'd like to thank SAMHSA for putting me in an age group with 26-year-olds. So thanks, SAMHSA. You're my favorite federal agency. Second, what stands out is overwhelmingly clear. Most people don't use, no matter what the age group is. If you're looking at past month use, which most scientists use as a measure of current use, you can see that in 12 to 17-year-olds, it's about 6-7%. The group that I tend to work with uses most heavily, 20 to 22%. Our age group, 6.5 to 8%. But what the flip side clearly shows, most people don't use. Let's jump to a different data set, the Monitoring the Future study out of the University of Michigan. Wow, since the 1970s, data on 8th graders, 10th graders, 12th graders, college students, and young adults not in college. Any cannabis use in the past month? Most aren't using. 12% of 8th graders, 29% of 10th graders, 36% of high school seniors. If you look at past 30-day use, 6.6% of 8th graders, 18.4% of 10th graders, 22.3% of the seniors. How does that compare to the most recent representative data from our state? In Washington State, it's almost identical. Modern the Future does not have sixth graders. So for sixth graders, it's 1% with any past 30-day use. Eighth graders, 7%. What's the average nationally? Rounding up, 7%. 10th graders, 18%. And there's 18. Among high school seniors in our state, different data set, 26% compared to 22 nationally, but overwhelmingly most don't use. Why am I telling you this? We have decades of research that show that if someone genuinely believes everyone does something, they're more likely to start. I want to fit in. And if what I hear is everyone's doing this, I might start. There's also research that shows that those that do it, if they think it's way more prevalent than it is, not only might they continue using, they could even continue using with consequences. This trend continues when you reach the age group I work with. On college campuses, 43% use at least once in the past year. What does that mean? Most college students don't use. Most aren't using in the past month, 26% past month use. There are those that are using heavily, 5.9% with use 20 or more days in the past month. If you look at young adults not in college, rates are very comparable. I learned that the article I've been first author on that has the most citations is a study we did now 16 years ago with 3 schools in Washington State, survey of just shy of 6,000 students. We asked them, how often have you used marijuana in the past year? A third said at least once. So what do most students do? Not use. 2/3 hadn't used. When we ask people, what does the typical student do? What's the right answer? Doesn't use. Only 2% of students got that right. 98% of people said, well, the typical person uses. In our study, the more mispronounced that perception was, the more likely students were to use and use with consequences. I was presenting this in a class to peer health educators at the University of Washington. And one of them raised their hand and said, hey, no offense, but your study's getting old. I was like, you're getting old. And I'm like, all right, we can check that out. Let's take a look at more recent data. I'm the principal investigator of our state's Young Adult Health Survey, where we have collected data from 18 to 25-year-olds since before retail stores opened in 2014 and every year since then. What did we find in a state with legal weed that has more recent data? We do see that compared to data collected in 2014 before stores opened, there has been an increase among young adults if you compare across cohorts, a significant increase in those latter 3 cohorts. We also see a significant linear increase, such that on average, any past year use is going up. However, if you do the flip side of all of this, what do most do? Not use. Most are abstaining. When we ask people, what does the typical person your age do in Washington? There's the same 2% that get it right. 2% correctly say, I feel like the typical person never uses. What's scary if you look over time is by that last cohort, 1 in 5 young adults in Washington genuinely thought the typical person their age used daily. I'm sorry if this was data heavy. If you're like, move past the data, you're in luck because I'm moving past the data. And if people hear, don't worry about it, everybody does it, that's not true. And adults are so influential in being able to correct those misperceptions. This is not a single study showing this. I've shown you multiple studies for multiple data points. What's scary is that despite research showing how risky cannabis can be, perceived risk of marijuana in this very same study is going down. Perceived risk of occasional use and regular use, both physically and psychologically. Perceived risk of alcohol is going up. With the exception of physical risk of 5 or more drinks every weekend, young adults in Washington have always said that's a risky behavior. The key is the risks aren't out there. Great comment in the chat about kids don't often trust the statistics. And I think that's where we do all we can to show a consistent story. And there's things we can do to boost the meaningfulness of the data we collect. We ask about vaping, smoking, edibles, ripcord, dabbing. If you're like, ripcord, what's ripcord? We made it up. We wanted to see, are people lying on the survey? We ask about alcohol, cannabis, opiates, TPQ, MDMA. If you're like TPQ, we make that up. So we're able to look at things like that. There's a lot that can be done to boost the reliability and validity of surveys. And literally since the 1980s, we show these misperceptions exist. I think you're right. Sometimes they don't trust the data. The more we can make clear where the data come from, how many participants there are, we can start to boost the faith in those findings. And again, we'll talk about that as the night progresses. I feel like if people take one thing out of this today, is that we really need to play catch up on cannabis of 2022. What people are using is at potencies we've literally never before seen. If you orient the brain, such that the front of the brain's on the left, back of the brain's on the right. So I'm going to highlight, if you can see my cursor moving, a few points. Memory. This is where the hippocampus is. It affects attention, concentration, memory. The amygdala, where judgment or decision-making is. Here's movement, sensations. Back of the head, the occipital lobe. This is where vision is. Here's coordination. Any drug that involves a high, we tend to see activity in the reward pathway. The most well-studied cannabinoid in cannabis, THC. In distant second place is CBD. Other cannabinoids are virtually unstudied. Where does THC bind in the brain? All over the place. I can't graphically show you a high any better than showing you the reward pathway and demonstrating that THC binds all over the place there. I root for kids. I believe in kids. We're working with driven people who are motivated. For years, people have said, does marijuana affect your motivation? Well, motivation is hard to measure, but what regulates motivation? The anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Don't worry about all the fancy words. Where's that in the brain? Right there. So does cannabis use impact motivation? We certainly can suggest that it can and does. Pardon me. So the key is we need to pay attention to THC. What do scientists consider the strong stuff? High potency cannabis, anything over 10% THC. Let's keep that number in mind. This article came out and showed that with any seizure by the DEA of cannabis in the illicit market, for 20 years, a sample went to the University of Mississippi and they tested it for THC levels, CBD levels, any adulterants. When you hear people who are older today reflecting on their time in the 60s and 70s, and they say that they, in quotes, smoked grass, it's because it was practically grass. It was 1%, maybe 1.5% THC. In the 80s, 2 to 3% THC. May all of your retirements grow like this. By 95, it was at 4%. By 2001, 6%. By 2006, 8%. We've been double digits since 2010. But then this runs out. Well, at the end of 2021, they updated it. And they showed that in the illicit market, it has been high potency cannabis for the past decade. That's in the illicit market. What happened in states that have legalized for non-medical purposes? This is Washington's second ever marijuana impact report. And at the time it was released, the average potency in what people use for smoking, a never before seen 13.18%. Never before seen until you come to Washington. One store in Seattle said, I have nothing to hide. We'll open our doors. You can evaluate our product, put it in the report. In that one store, the average potency of smokable bud or flower, 21.62%. Hash oils, concentrates, what people use for dabbing, nationwide, over 55%. That store in Seattle was pushing 72%. To show you a different way to bring this to life, Smart and colleagues said, let's look at what was sold in Washington stores after stores opened. This is a beautiful slide. Takes a little bit of time to realize what you're looking at. Along the vertical or y-axis is percentage of sales in Washington. Along the horizon or x-axis, month and year. What's that little baby blue sliver? Cannabis with THC under 10%. That's been virtually eliminated from the market. Brick red, 10 to 15, green, 15 to 20, purple, over 20. And any doubt was eliminated when Cash and colleagues said Let's look at states that have made changes in their legislation. Colorado, 95.91% of the Colorado market is high potency cannabis. California, which didn't just legalize for non-medical or in quotes recreational purposes, did have some medical dispensaries. It was 95.90. It was 0.01% different. The only difference is in California, a larger piece of the pie or pizza, as it may be, was 10 to 15%. In Washington, it's 97% is high potency cannabis. Two things. When people say it's just weed, what's the big deal? My friends, the science suggests it stopped being just weed years ago. When people say, but it's natural, cannabis of this potency does not occur in nature. This takes intentional extraction of cannabinoids. This takes intentional breeding of created high potency strains. Who cares? Why does this matter? If I'd have done this talk 5 years ago, we'd be wrapping up much more rapidly. So much new data has genuinely gotten the scientific community concerned. A study came out across 11 cities in Europe and Brazil in the summer of 2019. Remember the summer of 2019? And we were so simple back then. They showed that daily use of high potency cannabis, anything over 10%, increased the odds of developing a psychotic disorder 5 to 6 times compared to people who don't use it all. A study at the start of the pandemic showed that among adolescents, they followed them to the age of 24, who used high potency cannabis in the United Kingdom, anything over 10%, more likely to get addicted, more generalized anxiety disorder. Out of Canada, for concentrates and extracts, more problematic cannabis use, being addicted, cannabis use disorder, and more mental health disorders. I was honored to be one of 9 scientists approached by the state when they said, we feel like something's changed and we need to get a ruling. And we don't want any one researcher to have to make a conclusion because there could be bias. We don't want any one school to have to make a conclusion. So they almost jokingly said, University of Washington and Washington State University, you guys are rivals. You don't agree on anything. If you, all 9 of you, can generate a consensus statement, this will see the light of day. If you can't agree, this will go nowhere. All 9 of us agreed. And you can go to this website that's in your handouts. And if you click on it, you'll see a 20-page report. If you're like 20 pages, there's a 2-page Cliff Notes summary. Cliff was my favorite author in high school. There's even PowerPoint slides you can use. And in reviewing that document for tonight's presentation, I was reminded of 2 conclusions that all scientists agreed on. Young people are really vulnerable. From a brain development standpoint, honestly, even before the age of 25. And especially those using this high potency stuff frequently, this is not good. The risk of developing addiction, particularly among adolescents, increases with these high potency cannabis products. So this has been a whirlwind, and I tried to pick 5 domains relevant to education, prevention, public health, especially relevant to kids. And I'll go through those now. Thank you for those that have used the chat. If there's anything you need clarified, again, I'll have time for questions when we're done. Number 5 is the impact on cognitive abilities. If I could show one slide to college students or kids in high school that want to go to college one day, I would show them this slide. The part of the brain that, among other things, affects attention, concentration, and memory is the hippocampus. Truly long story short, after marijuana use, the neurons in that part of the brain slow down. They fire, but they fire at a rate that's lower and slower than they could be firing. Harrison Pope is a researcher who in the 1990s said, I want to test this with college students, but I don't want to get people super high, make them take a test and say, well, clearly it affected their cognitive abilities. He said, that's not good research. I want them to use weed and I want to test them a day later, 24 hours later. What did Dr. Pope find? 24 hours after marijuana use, there were measurable decreases in attention, concentration, and memory. And the more frequently students used, the more pronounced these decreases were. Scientists said, wow, that is a game changer. Critics said, is it? It doesn't prove anything. It's not causal. What if people who struggle with attention happen to be attracted to marijuana? You don't know what comes first. So Dr. Pope said we can test that. Ethically, we can't take people who don't use and make them start because that's unethical. But what if we take people who use every day and have them quit? If we follow them over time and their cognitive abilities stay the same, yeah, maybe they were there to start with. But if we follow them over time and as they abstain, their cognitive abilities get better, that's causal. It takes 4 weeks, 28 days. But 28 days after stopping daily marijuana use, there are no longer any measurable differences in attention, concentration, and memory compared to a control group of people who've never used cannabis in their life. Susan Taper, my former classmate and friend down in San Diego, said, forget daily use. What if we look at on average every other day? And what if we look at 15 to 19-year-olds? Verbal learning takes 2 weeks of abstinence to match that of people who don't use. Verbal working memory, 3 weeks of abstinence. Attention takes the full 4 weeks. Think of what this means. If a student says, I have ADHD, I'm being treated for it, we can look him in the eye and say, marijuana is a horrible fit, because we know of no substance more associated with causing attention decreases, let alone worsening existing ones. If someone says, I wonder if I have ADHD, can I get a prescription? And they're using cannabis, how can we possibly diagnose if they do or don't have an attention issue if they're using a substance that causes attention decreases? I tell students, you know yourselves best. If you say I want to do well in school and you're doing well in school, awesome. If you say I want to do well in school, but my memory's terrible, I can't pay attention, I can't focus, I can't concentrate, and you're using cannabis, stopping your marijuana use will absolutely result in improvements in these cognitive abilities and will pay dividends in the classroom. Don't take my word for it. Look at the science. DuPont and colleagues showed that of all the problems that contribute to dropping out, substance use is one of the easiest to identify and one of the most easily stopped by interventions, including treatment. When kids make a change in their substance use, they do better in school. Students that use substances are at increased risk for academic failure, including dropping out. And both alcohol and marijuana are associated with poor academic outcomes. But marijuana has an even stronger relationship. That second point, stronger negative relationship. As marijuana goes up, academic outcomes goes down. GPA, grade point average, other outcomes, and risk for dropout than alcohol use. The more severe the substance use, the more likely the impact on academic performance and risk for dropping out. It doesn't go away once they get to college. The more frequently college students use cannabis, the lower their grades are, the more classes they skip, the less likely are to still be enrolled, and the less likely are to graduate on time. Number 4, the impact of substance use on sleep quality and subsequent effects. These are data from the National College Health Assessment. I'm not trying to trick you into showing you college data. I just want to make a point though. This is data from over 30,000 students, 58 schools nationwide. How you doing in school? I'm doing great. They moved on. How you doing in school? Not the way I'd like. Here's 51 possible factors. What gets in the way of doing the way you want to do? Cannabis use was in 40th place. I've heard people mistakenly say cannabis isn't really associated with academic outcome. That's not true. It's that students don't connect the dots. My friend and colleague Amelia Aria at the University of Maryland said if we could do a better job putting a spotlight on these findings, then when students are struggling academically and using substances, we might actually boost help seeking because they realize, wow, if I change my substance use, I might do better in school. But what do students say are the big challenges? Putting stuff off, procrastination, stress, anxiety, and sleep problems. Want to have the perfect night's sleep? It should look like this. We have 5 stages of sleep: REM, rapid eye movement sleep; non-REM are the other stages, probably most well known as stage 4 or deep sleep. Sleep experts have made clear REM is totally overrated. It's not that more REM is better. Instead, you want a night that as the night progresses, time in REM gets longer, time in deep gets less and less and less. When people say, if I use marijuana at night, I fall asleep faster, that's true. It is a sedative, sedating, hypnotic sleep-inducing substance. But we can ask people, what do you notice about your sleep on nights where you use? Tell me about your dreaming. We hear two things. First, of the latter, they go, whoa, how did you know? I don't dream at all. Second, they say, I sleep hard. I sleep and I mean it. What they're calling sleeping hard is extension of stage 4 or deep sleep. Why don't they dream? Because they don't enter rapid eye movement sleep. Who cares? What's a night of REM deprivation associated with? Increases the next day in sleepiness, anxiety, irritability, and jumpiness. Use multiple nights in a row. This is additive or cumulative. Take a night off, body plays catch up. A person, we've all had a night of REM deprived sleep. What causes REM deprivation? Not sleeping, sleep deprivation. Think of the last time you only got an hour or two of sleep. The next day, if you can pull it off, you sleep for 9-10 hours. How do you feel when you wake up? Tired, groggy, headache. I can't graphically show you insomnia any better than right there. A person slams so fast into deep, immediately into REM, this leads to difficulty both falling and staying asleep. Plus, once they get to REM, too much time in REM, not enough time in the other stages of sleep, increase in fatigue the next day. What do very driven college students tell us are 3 of their 4 biggest barriers to doing well in school? Stress, anxiety, and sleep problems. I would never say I'm talking to a college student, but you can see that all three of those could be made worse by their cannabis use at night. They could flat out be caused by their cannabis use at night. Number 3, I already showed you the science on high potency cannabis and mental health. Talking a bit more about that, Dr. Wayne Hall at the University of Queensland in Australia is planet Earth's single biggest name in cannabis research. And his early research showed we've got to do all we can to keep this out of kids' hands. Those that had used cannabis 10 or more times by the age of 18 were 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Packaged with the 40s article from summer of 2019, this tells a very consistent story. In fact, the science is so clear, Hall and Degenhart concluded 13% of schizophrenia could go away if cannabis use was prevented. I had the honor of moderating a webinar with Dr. Hall, and I said, after legalization, if we could do one thing on college campuses, what would it be? And his answer surprised me. He said, I would screen for being addicted, for cannabis dependence, for cannabis use disorder in your health and counseling centers. I said, wow, I didn't expect that answer. How come? He said, we do not know what comes first. We don't know what drives what, but we see a scary 3-way interaction between depression, suicide, and cannabis use disorder that is so strong that if someone willing to ask for help for their depression flags as being addicted to marijuana, our anxiety about suicide risk goes through the roof. He said, if you have a waiting list, do not put them on the waiting list. They become #1 priority for assignment to a provider. When you look at our own country's data, there's something there. This is not causal. But if you look at all adults compared to adults with any past year marijuana use, serious thoughts of suicide, 2.5 times greater. Making a suicide plan, 2.5 times greater. Attempting suicide, almost 3 times greater. If they reach the level of being addicted, having a past year substance use disorder, thoughts go up 4-fold. Making a suicide plan, 4.5 times. Attempting suicide, 5.5 times greater. When I hear students say, well, you can't overdose on marijuana, right? Well, we know about hyperemesis, which is violent, aggressive vomiting. Sometimes students call it greening out. But what we also see is there can be an acute toxic psychosis, seeing, hearing things, feeling things on them that aren't there, hallucinations, delusions, being really paranoid, for example, complete out-of-body stuff. We call it depersonalization. What causes it? Too much being used or potency too high. What have we seen in Washington? Potency's gone through the roof. Wouldn't it have been nice to go 90 minutes and not hear this word? Well, you're in luck, because I'm not going to say this word. I've been Voldemorting the name of this virus, the virus that shall not be named. But we'd only been home 2.5 weeks. We got sent home at the University of Washington March 6th, 2020. 2.5 weeks later, the National Institute on Drug Abuse said, heads up, because it attacks the lungs, this virus could be a real threat to those that smoke tobacco or marijuana or who vape. By summer of 2020, researchers at Stanford University showed that those that smoke or vape not only are more likely to get sick, if they get sick, they have an infection that's more severe. Any doubt was eliminated when Gaia, Cheng, and Halper and Fischer published a study of 13 to 24-year-olds, and they showed that those that vape, 5 times greater likelihood in testing positive, those that vape and smoke, 7 times greater likelihood. If people say, listen, we don't have time to be addressing substance use, our number one priority is the pandemic. Know that what you do about substance use will have an impact on lung health, transmission, and having an impact on the degree to which people are getting sick. If at this point in the presentation, you're thinking to yourself, wow, Jason Kilmer, you've had strong skills with your stylus, you would be right. The first time my stylus shot out of my laptop, I was like, oh my God, I broke my laptop. And my friend said, no, it's a stylus. I'm like, I don't know what that is. And she said, you can use it to draw stuff. Now I've shown to the Shelley Willises of the world, the Amy's of the world, my drawings in the past, and I didn't want to ever be the person that shows the same things. So I've tried to improve, and I've moved toward weather-themed stylus drawings. So during the heat wave this summer, where we had those 100-degree days, I do this for my coworkers. I feel like that's an enjoyable use of the stylus and my coworkers' time. This winter, one of my colleagues said, could you draw me a reindeer? And I made it an R-A-I-N deer, because that's unbelievably hilarious. And in January, I gave this to all my coworkers. It was Washington neighborhood animals in January, a squirrel going so wet, so cold, a bird going so wet, so cold, and that majestic slug saying best month ever. So I really need hobbies and friends. So reach out to me afterwards. The number one thing, addiction risk and withdrawal. If you're still going, wait, go back to the addiction part. Can you get addicted to marijuana? Yes, you can. We talk about a cannabis use disorder. We used to talk about cannabis dependence and cannabis abuse. Since 2013, it's a cannabis use disorder, and based on the number of symptoms people endorse, it's a rating of mild, moderate, or severe. We know that 9% of those who become addicted, that number doubles when they start young. If it gets to the point of daily use, and these are data that are now almost 8 years old, it's 25 to 50%. But notice that compared to those that begin using as adults, those who start as adolescents are 2 to 4 times as likely to develop cannabis dependence within 2 years. I hope none of you mishear me. If you have a friend, a family member, a loved one with a gravely disabling or potentially lethal condition that's had medical cannabis recommended, then bless that person. That's not who I'm talking about. But as we all acknowledge, the last 23 months have been rough. I really worry about the 18-year-old who says, nah, I don't want to talk to a counselor. I'm just because marijuana is helping me. Or the 18-year-old that says, I don't want to take my meds. I want to use marijuana because that's natural. And here's why. I had the honor of presenting in Canada the week that they were legalizing nationwide for recreational or non-medical use. And what was crazy is as they were opening the floodgates on access to non-medical sources, their medical providers were saying, we've got to slow down on medical use of marijuana. This article is a brilliant read. And what they say is, let's look at what do we know about any medication? You want to know, do the benefits outweigh the risks or side effects? Is it addictive? Has it been evaluated in randomized controlled trials compared to a placebo condition? And are there treatments that work? They said in this flow chart, is someone saying, hey, can I get a card for medical cannabis? If yes, that's what they're asking for. Is it for neuropathic pain, palliative and end-of-life pain, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, or spasticity due to multiple sclerosis or spinal cord injury? If no, we're done. We're not giving it for headaches, for sleep, for anxiety, for depression. Why? The science is not there. The benefits do not outweigh the numerous consequences. It is addictive. And there are therapies and treatments that work. Only if yes, have they tried traditional therapies or treatments first? If no, go back to the drawing board. If yes, they say only then consider a medical cannabinoid, but heads up, people shouldn't be smoking their medicine. And if you continue to enjoy the stylus drawings, I really think my squirrel game is strong. So there you go. People go, but what about CBD? Come on. Everything's so anxiety provoking right now. This is a brilliant study by Arndt and DeWitt, where they said, what if we have people be their own control groups? The hard part about CBD is when people go, oh, you're anxious? Here, use this, it'll help. It introduces a placebo or expectancy effect. They recruited people who all signed consent forms that said, I agree to take something that could include CBD. There were 4 different conditions. They randomized the order to control for practice effects. And it was a double-blind experiment. What does that mean? They eliminated expectancies. People taking it didn't know they were taking. The person bringing it to them didn't know what they were bringing them. What'd they give them? 300, 600, or 900 milligrams of CBD or a placebo, sugar. They had people, after they took it, gave time for it to kick in, and then introduced negative emotional stimuli, got people upset. They tried to induce unwanted affect or mood. If you eliminate expectancies, what did CBD do? Nothing. I hope no one mishears me. You saw on the previous slide from Alan and colleagues that there are 4 domains in which cannabinoids could be indicated medically. But quoting verbatim, oral CBD does not alter responses to emotional stimuli or produce anxiolytic-like. What does that mean? Anxiety-reducing-like effects in healthy human subjects. My friends, it's been a stressful 23 months. How's that number even real? If students are anxious or struggling, we want them to get connected with support services that work rather than a product making the promise of effectiveness when the science just isn't there. And finally, I worry about how many people are reporting that it's helping them medically when they're actually managing withdrawal. Dr. Christine Lee asked incoming first-year students who use cannabis, tell us why you use. And they said things like, I like getting high. I like the feeling, helps me bond with my friends, gives me something to do when I'm bored, makes things more fun, music sounds better, it's cool, it helps me celebrate. But they also said, helps me relax, helps me sleep, helps me cope when I'm depressed, relieves stress, helps when my appetite stinks, reduces anxiety, alleviates physical pain, helps when I have a headache. Is marijuana addictive? Yes. Are there clear criteria for cannabis withdrawal? Also, yes. What does that list include? It is this list. Anxiety, sleep problems, appetite problems, depressed mood, and headaches. If someone says, no, that guy was wrong, I know it helps my anxiety. How do you know? If they say I use weed every day. Last week I ran out for 3 days. My anxiety was brutal. Couldn't sleep. Finally got my hands on weed again. My anxiety got better. I could sleep. That's not marijuana helping your anxiety. That's resuming substance use, making withdrawal symptoms stop. And that's an instance of managing addiction, not underlying anxiety or depression. Super side note, number 5, restlessness. I hear too many students who say, I don't think your data about marijuana and ADHD are right because every time I don't use, I can't sit still. Look at number 5. That's withdrawal. I'm very mindful of the time. I want to know, do people know what time it is? It's bonus content time. Woo! I picked 5 things. I had to include a 6th. We know the authors of Initiative 502 said driving under the influence at 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood for those over 21, any positive amount for those under 21. Why 5 nanograms? It's not the same as being drunk, but you see the same impairment in reaction time and ability to shift focus as we see at 0.08 for alcohol. How long does it take to drop below 5? A brand new article says at least 6 to 8 hours after inhaling, 8 to 12 hours after ingesting. A year after stores opened in our state, fatalities behind the wheel of a car doubled. By 2017, we were the first state for drug driving deaths to exceed drunk driving deaths. And if a picture's worth 1,000 words, here's how 2020 started for us. This is not police activity. This is not DUIs. This is not a new way of testing. This is fatalities Percentage of drivers in fatal crashes who are THC positive. Steady, 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 steady. Black line was legalization. Here's where we've gone since. I tell you this because for our 15-and-a-half-year-olds with learner's permits, for our 16-year-olds getting licenses, we've got to make sure that they understand this. People know, don't drink and drive. We're done hearing, I drive better when I'm high, not according to a single published study ever. I made reference to that article. This article by Fisher and colleagues, look at the title. It doesn't say low risk guidelines. It says lower risk. Why? They said, if you look at the science, there is no low risk use. Any amount of cannabis use incurs risk. You want to avoid the harms? Don't use. Unfortunately, most kids aren't using. And there is that guidance about driving from the article. So wrapping up, I said I had 45 minutes. I'm sitting right at 45. I just want to say, know that adults, a guardian or guardians, a parent, parents, a caregiver is so influential. My friend Annie Fairley asked incoming college students, spring semester, they did it the summer before they started college, 10 months later, spring semester of their first year of school, 22 months later, they tried to predict binge drinking, 5 drinks in a row for males, 4 drinks in a row for females. And all they wanted to predict was social modeling, number of close friends who drink heavily, perceived friend approval of drinking and getting drunk, and parental permissiveness. Want to see a perfect figure? Data never turn out this perfect. What's the top line? High social modeling, high parental permissiveness. What's the next line down? High social modeling, low parental permissiveness. Parents altered the college experience of students that went to fraternities, sororities, high-risk drinking friend groups. Next line down, low social modeling, high permissiveness. Next line down, low social modeling, low parental permissiveness. My favorite slide from the Healthy Youth Survey, right here. Hey kids, do you think your parents think it's wrong for you to use marijuana or not wrong? Kids that say my parents would say it's wrong for me to use, these are high school sophomores, 10th graders, 13% have used in the past 30 days. Kids that say my parents don't care, 59%. You saw slides full of data. There's not a single age group where most use, most sophomores in high school who said my parents don't think it's wrong if I use, report past 30-day use. Look at what you're all doing on a town hall meeting. Even kids that say my community would think it's wrong if I use have lower rates than when kids say my community wouldn't care. Kids that live with someone who uses cannabis have 3.5 times greater prevalence of regular use. The Healthy Youth Survey defines regular use 6 or more days in the past 30. Notice the 18% to 5% difference for sophomores in high school if they don't live with someone that uses cannabis. In our young adult health survey, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who use cannabis, we've seen a decreasing trend across cohorts in 18, 19, 20-year-olds getting it from friends and getting it from medical outlets, which makes sense because medical dispensaries closed in Washington. Where has it gone up? Giving money to someone to give it to them, getting it from family, getting it from parents with their permission. I don't know if the parents are unaware of how cannabis has changed. I don't know if they're unaware of the academic impacts, the mental health impacts, but parents matter in a big, big way. I will end by saying the good news is there are resources. The state has Start Talking Now. I wrote .org. I will correct that for the handouts. It's .com, as I clearly see now. There's learnaboutmarijuana.org/parents. There's a guide from Seattle Children's in the Social Development Resource Group, which is a parent's guide to preventing underage marijuana use. But one of my favorite resources, even if you're not the parent of a college student, is collegeparentsmatter.org. If you go to it, click on topics. One of the topic is cannabis. And it'll give you guidance on what do you do if you're not sure your kid's using, your child uses, but you don't know how much or often, or you think they use regularly. The global tips they give, don't be afraid to start the conversation. As a family member, you're allowed to disapprove of substance use. Give yourself permission to disapprove. Number 3, banish any fear that your disapproval is naive. I'm sorry I went long, Jennifer. I've spent 48 minutes going over science that clearly shows why we can disapprove of this by use among youth. Focus on one message during the conversation. Reject the myth that discouraging substance use is useless because, quote, everyone's doing it. You've seen the data. Make communication a regular activity and recognize the power of your influence. I'm married to a 6th grade teacher who I could not do what she does and has gone back to in-person, which also means she's gone back to grading assignments in person. I asked her for permission to show a de-identified version of this because it's the greatest assignment I've ever seen. Either this kid's super funny or there's a small chance that 80s music has broken this child. I was in high school from 1983 to 1987, so I'm a big fan of 80s music. The assignment, label the continents and the oceans. This child labeled Africa as Africa by Toto, which of course is the amazing 80s band who sings about blessing the rains down in Africa. If this kid's trying to be funny, well done. If they're not, those parents are awesome, and there's a good chance we've broken this child. So I will end by saying, just keep doing what you're doing. The communities that do stuff like we're doing tonight are the ones I've seen seeing successes. The ones that aren't getting the science out there, the ones that aren't talking about it, sadly, we're seeing some setbacks. So with that, I had to put that slug up there one more time. My email address is jkilmer@uw.edu. If there's a study I reference that you'd like, please, please, please email me. I work for the Center for the Study of Health and Risk Behaviors at the University of Washington. We're on Twitter. If you want to follow us, see what we're up to, we're at CSHRB_UW. If you want to tweet something about tonight, we'd be up to the challenge of trying to learn how to retweet it or reply to it, which might take us a long time to do. But with that, I'm going to stop talking, tag back over to Jennifer as our moderator. Jennifer, I hope that my 5 minutes over didn't mess you up.
If it wasn't National Pizza Day, I might be very upset, but given that I have the pie in my eye, so to speak, you know, I'm willing to get over it.
Well,
How about you all? We down with that? So I guess, you know, just I got some questions about, you know, copies of the slides.
Yes.
In our pre and post poll, if you would like follow up with us, please let us know. And we, you know, upon registration, we do have your email, so we can follow up with you and give you that information. Would love to, are happy to, and are appreciative of, you know, any more connections that we can build with all of you. I guess I just want to, it looks like the chat's very happy, but I'm wondering if there are any questions out there.
I'm delighted to say it is starttalkingnow.org. The screenshot redirects you. It is definitely starttalkingnow.org. So I was not inaccurate on my slide, which makes me feel a lot better. Thank you for the kind feedback in the chat. What questions do people have? What can I clarify? I have one person that agrees on the squirrel drawings. Thank you for that.
You know, Jason, I actually do have a question, and it's about balancing both the norms part of our discussion as well as, so we know most young adults, most kids don't use, right? But those that do use, there are these, you know, grave concerns. So how do you, you know, recommend people balance that in their mind in terms of realizing that most kids don't, but
Right.
then if they do, this is important.
Sandra Wolfson is the first researcher that showed that the most significant misperceptions of cannabis use come from those that use most heavily. If a person uses daily, they're convinced that literally everyone uses daily and all of your data are wrong. And partly why there's an amazing question in the chat about motivational interviewing. And does motivational interviewing work with folks who are using cannabis? Yes. We have published a motivational interviewing based brief intervention that showed significant reductions in use and consequences with college students. There's with general adults, there's research that shows that this works. Motivational interviewing, you could spend a whole hour on and more, is an approach developed by Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick. It's a non-judgmental, non-confrontational approach. And part of how change gets considered is if we can develop discrepancies between values and goals that are of importance to the person and ways in which the status quo could be in conflict with that. What's my value? I want to have fun. I just don't want to be like that person who's using like the most weed of everyone. What's the status quo? If someone finds out, you're at the 99th percentile, which means you use as much or more than 99% of other kids your age, that could present or could prompt thinking about making a change. The other big part of motivational interviewing that's worth bringing up It's supporting a person's confidence and optimism that they can change, supporting self-efficacy. Too often we hear people that use say, but I can't quit, because if I quit, I'll be alone. Like everyone uses. That is not true. So what is our number one goal? Delay the initiation of use. For those majority who aren't using, we can do all we can to keep them abstaining. And partly one of the ways to do that is to let them know, in fact, most people aren't using. For those that do use, if norms are important to them, fantastic. But if they're not, that's okay. Per motivational interviewing, we find out what does matter most to them. What's their hook? And so as we look for the hook, any one thing we bring up technically is bait. If they bite, great. And if they don't, that's completely okay.
Looks like we got a couple of questions in the chat. First one is, would you mind sharing examples of messages your schools share with teens and college students? And then the follow-up question is, would this be a good presentation for teens and young adults, or would you point to messages with the media campaigns?
My favorite quote from the biggest tool we have on college campuses about alcohol prevention is that a mix of strategies is best. I think that's true here too. You need policies, enforcement of those policies, education, prevention, intervention, and even referral to treatment when there are students that need it. I've been invited to present to high school students and middle school students before. Give me a fraternity over middle school students any day because it's scary to me. But I've loved it when I've done it. And I do think I think middle school and high school students are smart. There's a way to present this that gets the science out there. And, that was not the audience tonight, though shout out to, I know at least one student participated, and I appreciate that. I appreciate your interest in this topic. But there is a way to do that. What we find is scare tactic-y stuff doesn't tend to work as well. We don't need to be scare tactic-y when the science is pretty scary. So as long as we can provide references, back up what we're saying, and cite the work that we do, it's just highlighting the types of things that are relevant for this age group. I'm sorry, I get excited about this. I could talk about this forever.
Well, we got some more for you, Jason. So if teens use once a week, does it still have a long-term impact? Any studies on the effects of intermittent use?
So that's research that ethically we just couldn't do, right? We can't randomly assign teams to use once a week. The research that Susan Tapert's lab did in San Diego showed that averaging 14 times out of 30 days, essentially every other day, you did see dramatic impacts on cognitive abilities. Using once a week is certainly not that, but that still is trickling toward fairly frequent use. The Monitoring the Future study defines heavy or frequent use as 5 times or more per month. Once a week, depending on the shape of the month, could trickle toward that 5 times. So I will say that to be able to prospectively say, here's what this would mean, that research ethically couldn't be done. I think the science compellingly shows that there's concern about brain development, that there's concern about mental health. I'm going to share a bonus slide.
Do we need some music for that?
Not at all. That article on lower risk guidelines actually said this. I came with some bonus slides in case there are questions. They made 3 general precautions, 12 recommendations. One of them was there are some specific groups of people at elevated risk for cannabis use-related health problems because of biological predispositions or comorbidities. They should accordingly, and possible on medical advice as required, avoid or adjust their cannabis use. This article was meant for adults, not for kids, but I wanted you to see this part. Higher risks for harm extend to individuals with a genetic predisposition for, in other words, an immediate family member, or personal history, or an active psychosis, mood, depressive disorder, or substance use disorder. If there's someone using once a week who has a family history of addiction or mental health concerns, or if they're actively dealing with depression or a mental health issue themselves, then yes, that's really risky use because they could even theoretically be encouraged to abstain outright. That article was a game changer when it was released August 28th, 2021, because unlike some articles that come just out of the US, this was the greatest collection of who's who and international researchers. Harm reduction researchers from Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Canada, Mexico, one author from the US, all saying this is risky stuff.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's like take a moment to breathe. It's a lot of great information. Just keeping in mind there is pizza to look forward to for those of you that haven't had your pie yet. There's that motivation, right?
Happy National Pizza Day, everybody.
Right. So yes, in like starting to move on, just because we want to like offer the second part of our double bill, right, which is Penny Lipsu, and that's our legislative guest speaker from the American Heart Association. Penny has very graciously agreed to come speak with us tonight, and in particular, it's really just trying to offer information about what's happening currently. We have like this new information that we reviewed with Jason. We're up to date on what high potency means, what sales are like in Washington, what are the impacts on kids, how do they use, how don't they use, right? And here we have Penny, who is currently works as the government relations director at the American Heart Association. She was previously for 3 sessions, which I think counts in 5 years, maybe some sort of time, as a legislative aide with Representative Nicole Macri, and has a master's in social work. One of the reasons why I asked Penny, and doggedly so, bless Penny for coming, was that Penny speaks in a way where it's not only the content, but the accessibility of her content. I love great communicators. And I was so happy to have Dr. Kilmer here as our, our out of the park home run. So with that, I'll just open it up for Penny. Thank you so much again, Penny, for being here with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you, Dr. Kilmer. That was a fascinating, really fun presentation to hear. And I apologize to everyone. I don't have fun stylus drawings for you. I wish I did, and we'll be working on those because those are very cool, especially the reindeer. So I am here. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for hanging in here with me. To just kind of talk more high level about the current Washington State legislative session. I am happy to, I don't have a lot of details similar to Dr. Kilmer, but in terms of the policies that I'll speak on later. But just kind of want to give a high level overview, and please feel free to pop any questions in the chat as I'm talking. I'm happy for this to be as informal as possible at this hour. I also recognize that, a lot of folks on here might be limited to how you engage with the legislature, depending on what your role is. And we also have resources for that too, if you're interested in engaging. And so just to take a step back, I'll say that we are at the halfway point of the legislative session. It's fast and furious. It's a short session. It's all virtual for public. It started January 10th. It's 60 days and it ends March 10th. And so today is a really big week. That's a great question, Shelley. I'll address that in a minute. So today, this is week 5 of the legislative session, and we just finished the fiscal committee cutoff. So a lot of the bills that have fiscal notes or that impact the budget in certain ways, if they didn't make it out of those marathon committees by Monday, then they are not moving forward. We've had about 2,000 bills introduced over the biennium, the 2-year cycle. So 2021 is the longer session and 2022 is the supplemental follow-up session to that. And that's kind of how the legislature works in these 2-year cycles. The thing that is nice about this Zoom, also shout out to Zoom, is that it is much more accessible to interact with the legislature, sign in pro or con on various bills you might be interested in. I want to just also say that at the Heart Association, we haven't taken real formal positions on cannabis policies, but we are very invested in tobacco prevention and eliminating the use of tobacco misuse. And so I have been working with a lot of prevention advocates, in particular on tobacco policies, and those two I can speak on as well. But so I'm not as familiar about all the details of cannabis policy. I do see that Shelley asked a question of when will we see a bill to regulate potency of THC in cannabis, which is a great question. And I know that Representative Davis has attempted to tackle this previously. And I think this will be something that legislators continue to grapple with. I'm not sure what the status is of cannabis, regulating cannabis right now. I know that you all might be familiar with Delta 8, which is a type of cannabinoid that there's a LCB request legislation to allow for regulation on that. And I'll say there's just a lot of similarities as a person who's been really focused on tobacco policies and how innovative the tobacco industry is, and how hard it is to catch up. Dr. Kimler mentioned that. And that's something that we're also trying to do in terms of nicotine addiction, and how e-cigarettes and vapor products have really hooked a new generation of users, and how hard it is to regulate that, and how much we don't know about nicotine levels and what's in different devices. And so another thing Dr. Kimler was mentioning was, just kind of the behavioral spectrum of care, and how education and prevention, and how it is a multi-pronged approach in really discussing these issues with folks, and what prevention strategies are most effective. And so I would say we'll highlight two bills that we've been working on closely this session. And one is Senate Bill 5129, which is about the enforcement of commercial tobacco. And we're trying to take away really intense civil penalties for minors in particular, knowing that they've been so aggressively marketed, disproportionately by the tobacco industry, and trying to make the enforcement more on the retail sales level, and having a more systemic approach to reduce access with youth. And there's other prevention strategies where we're trying to scale up as well, as tobacco prevention in particular has been chronically underfunded over the years. And Washington ranks 45th in the country when it comes to this particular public health infrastructure. So yeah, trying to shift the status quo in many different types of ways, and seeing prevention programming as very complementary when it comes to all different types of substances, right? And I'm happy to see if Dr. Kimmer wants to answer this question about Delta 8, Delta 10, since I see you still on here, and I could also keep talking about different policies. But I know that's been a really big topic in the prevention community. Put you on the spot, Dr. Kilmer.
Well, we go where the data take us. And so one of the things we often get worried about is who's describing it as vastly popular or the new thing, if the data aren't showing that's the case. So I know there are practitioner fact sheets that have been generated for those of us in Washington State, but we've just been very, very careful not to introduce awareness of something that may not even be on the age group we work with on their radar. We saw this with alcoholic energy drinks years ago, when we collected data from students after seeing all these headlines about these vastly popular alcoholic energy drinks. They weren't on students' radar until headlines put them there. So we've been very, very cautious about let's go where the data take us, and we're trying to keep our fingers on the pulse of that.
That's great. So yeah, I know there are a few different types of a few different coalitions too who are tracking cannabis bills that I can share with Jennifer to share with you all too. And I'll defer to Dr. Kilmer on any of these cannabis policy related questions. And I apologize, I don't know the substance around those as well, or kind of the trends around legislation in particular with cannabis. I know I'll say one thing that in terms of vapor products, we, where there's some overlap, but we are trying to, one thing that's unfortunate in our tax code right now is that e-cigarette with nicotine, in particular, those e-cigarette vapor products, they're taxed at a much lower rate than combustible cigarettes. And we're trying to fix that tax code to be more on par with other products as a behavioral health, public health intervention, and yeah, and I see Jason also, or Dr. Kilmer has a slide up. Oh.
Actually, it's me, Penny. I went ahead and pulled up some information about the vapor tax bill that's currently being in consideration, just to give people some idea of information that's, that's being put forward to help inform the public about not only what's there in the legislature, but what it could mean depending on its passage. So it's a way, if you're all interested, I'm happy to forward this along with the slides and the recording, access to the recording for your perusal and just to take a look at. As well, I also wanted to offer that I have prepared some information about contact for different districts. So here in the Central Western Washington region, we have about 5 different districts. And it's sometimes hard to know, like, where am I at, right? What exactly line am I on? So, I prepared some just contact slides, if any of that would be helpful, and as well have some like a 1-page follow-up with email addresses for assistance, legislative aides, as well as the legislators themselves. So this can be all part of a packet of information to pass along to you, all if you would like to get more involved. Of course, these will change after this legislative session because we have a new census and district maps, but of course this is important and we're in this like the high point of the session, so we encourage you to get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of accessible ways to get involved by emailing your legislator or signing in remotely pro or con on some of these bills that are making it through the second half of the session. I apologize, my dog has found the squeaky toy right now. But yeah, I'll say, touching back on the vapor tax rate discrepancy, for a jewel pod, for example, it's like 19 cents. The tax is about 19 cents for a jewel pod, or the concentrated pods, which have about the same amount as nicotine as like a cigarette pack, give or take, sometimes maybe more than that, and maybe some other chemicals we don't know fully. But then a cigarette pack excise tax is about $3.05. So just to kind of highlight the difference of, how cheap it is. And there's different, effective tax rates between vapor and e-cigarette products as well. And it's just something we're trying to fix, but it's also hard. The political realities of trying to pass a tax in an election year when you have a surplus budget make it incredibly challenging. But we will continue to push on because it is, we know, an effective prevention tool and something that does need to be fixed and can solve a lot of problems. Another thing we're hoping to do with that vapor product tax, or the vapor tax reform in particular, is to clean up the tax code and where the revenue goes to address disparities, and help, reinvest in communities who are most impacted by these products. And so, but yeah, I'm happy if anyone has kind of general questions on nuts and bolts of the legislature right now, or how session is going, or around Senate Bill 5129, changing enforcement practices, or the vapor product tax, or anything. Or if you have more questions for Dr. Kilmer, who is a wealth of knowledge and I think could really speak to some of the cannabis specifics.
Yeah, and also in follow-up, just to respect your time, we're about 7:26 by my clock. We have a follow-up poll that we'd like to ask you to complete. Again, this is to learn, how these presentations were for you, what we can learn from you, with you, and be responsive in future trainings that we offer. I'll also offer my email for anyone that would want to follow up with me for questions, or to sort of communicate any new questions that might come up as you think tonight, tomorrow, next week, however that be. Feel free to send me an email, and I'll do my best to relay them along and respond back.
Jennifer, do you want me to go ahead and launch that poll now?
Oh, yes, and I see Keitha.
Yeah, I just have a question. Are you going to send out the chat notes and the recordings to us, the people that registered?
The recording and the slides for sure. I hadn't thought about the chat notes, but would the chat notes be very helpful for everyone?
Yeah, because it'll have your email in it. Thank you, Jennifer.
Which of course, actually the follow-up from us will as well too, Keitha, but of course I can get those chat notes for you.
Okay, thank you.
I hope you can all see the post test now. If you can just take a minute to step through those, that'd be great.
Jennifer, may I ask one more question of Dr. Kilmer while we sort of wrap up? You referenced briefly the idea of policy change, and I obviously Penny gave us a bit of an overview of some of the high level policy change. But on local level, what kinds of policy recommendations might you make for parents or school administrators or city council members, county commissioner type people? How would you see the utility of the information you've shared tonight as they inform their decision making about local policy?
I do see a number of people have typed in the chat that the poll was there and it disappeared. So whoever launched the poll, if you could relaunch the poll, please. There it is.
Oh.
What a great question. And honestly, I'm always so quick to acknowledge the experts that I know of who do policy work and environmental approaches. Having heard some of the big names talk about that, the key thing is that whatever policies are in place, enforcing those and consistently enforcing those. Alex Wagoner, Tracy Toomey are some of the biggest names in the alcohol policy